Welcome, everybody, to the joint School of Economic Science Ontario, the Henry George Foundation of Canada, and the Progress and Poverty Institute, Princeton, New Jersey. I am Brendan Hennigan, President of the Henry George Foundation of Canada. I welcome all our guests in the room and those joining us online. Our meeting is taking place at the National Capital Region Officers' Mess in downtown Ottawa, Canada. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded and surrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We have three presenters today: Josie Fass, Executive Director of the Progress and Poverty Institute. She would be joining us online from Princeton. Frank Peddle, Executive Director of the Henry George Foundation of Canada, and Frank Dion, past board member of the Progress and Poverty Institute and past president of the Green Party of Ontario. They will be joining us from Ottawa. Today we'll be talking about land and its relevance to past, present, and future sustainable economies. It's a surprising fact on both sides of the border that in all the present discussion on housing affordability, the rising cost of living, that site value, the cost of land, is hardly ever mentioned. The American economist and social philosopher Henry George definition of land: the service of the earth, natural resources, and the forces of nature. When I first came to Canada 50 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel by train from Montreal to Vancouver, across the country. And I've got a lasting impression of the vastness of our country, but also the luminous soils of Quebec, Ontario, the Cambrian Shield, and the endless pine forests of northern Ontario, the undulating golden fields of the Canadian prairies, the majestic Rocky Mountains, and the Grand Pacific. This is our land, and the same would go for our American cousins as well. I also had the opportunity to work in the Canadian subarctic, recording the lives of the Dene people and Inuit people. Land has a sacred meaning to them. The Creator asked them to keep it as a sacred trust. Yesterday, we had a meeting of the School of Economics Science, and one of our members, Ken Yang, mentioned our key element of the social media campaigns outreach is storytelling. People sharing our fiscal and tax policies are negatively affecting their quality of life. Henry George was a journalist and an elegant orator. He told stories and made arguments using the empirical research of his time. Today, one of our other associates, Liam Wilkinson, talks about how economic modeling and good quality data is breaking new ground and supporting the arguments for land value capture. Both the Progress and Poverty Institute and the Canadian School of Social Science and the Henry George Foundation of Canada are leaders in the field of research in land value capture. Now, I would like, after that short introduction, I would like to welcome Josie Fass. Josie Fass, for the past 6 or so years, has been Executive Director of the Progress and Poverty Institute, previously known as the Robert Schackenbach Foundation. She has a PhD in urban planning. Josie will be talking about the research, present and future, and what direction the Institute is going. So over to you, Josie.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I'm really thrilled to be able to speak with you all today. My colleague, Steve Hoskins, is also going to make some remarks alongside me. But as Brendan said, yes, I'm the executive director of the Progress and Poverty Institute. We're located in Princeton, New Jersey. in the United States. Also, as Brendan said, we were formerly known as the Robert Schockenbach Foundation, actually for 100 years. This is our centennial year. We were founded in New York. We have since migrated to New Jersey, so not so far away. And have also recently changed our name. So Robert Schockenbach was the individual who endowed our foundation. He was a devout Georgist. He was a colleague of Henry George, president of the Manhattan Single Tax Club, an absolute champion of Henry George's ideas in his wisdom. He founded our organization through a bequest, and we are now entering our second century. Steve, if you could switch the slide, that'd be great. So right now we have 4 major program areas. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the organization, and then I'm going to talk to you, as Brendan said, about sort of this moment in history and how we are thinking about our work at this moment, and then sort of getting ready for what comes next. So we have 4 program areas. We give scholarships and fellowships to college students. We run a library and archive, the Engel Georges Library and Archive. We make competitive research grants, and we also do our own policy research and on-the-ground advocacy. Steve, if you could go forward. So our mission from day one has been to share the ideas of Henry George, preserve and share those ideas. And that has never changed. And in fact, we find ourselves in a moment in history, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, maybe not, that looks a whole awful lot like we looked in Henry George's time. A lot of the issues that we're confronting right now would probably feel very familiar to him. So the image on the screen right now, obviously the background is an American flag, but is probably familiar to all of us, right? It's Henry George and he's wrestling the snake. And I think I've seen it about 1,000,000 times. You probably have as well. But if you look at the words written on the snake, they probably look pretty resonant with what we are experiencing right now, particularly in this country. So a kind of familiar moment in history. So what are the factors, that we are confronting? We're in a time of profound technological innovation, just like George was, right? The technologies are different, but you can barely go a second without hearing about AI or seeing the products of AI, right? And there can be so completely lifelike and real seeming that it can be difficult to tell which way is up. We are a society of monopolies. Massive companies control major sectors of our lives. We're very familiar with them and with their ultra wealthy leadership. But we are, smaller businesses are struggling to survive, particularly in this country, particularly at this moment in history. We have massive wealth gaps, even greater than in George's time. So great that every one of us can probably name on 5 fingers the wealthiest people in the world, and there are names like Musk and Bezos and Thiel. And they are not just wealthy in their own right, but they have an outsized influence on public opinion, and they don't always use that influence for our betterment. At the same time, we have an affordable housing crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis that is so bad that we have a homelessness crisis that we, at least in this country, are treating more as a matter of criminal misconduct than as a failing of our society and our economy. And it all does come down to land, as Brendan said in his opening remarks. And yet, land is very rarely specifically spoken about, at least as a remedy to what we're experiencing. And of course, we're living in a time of climate change. And that can be sometimes convenient to set aside as we're sort of looking at the issue du jour. And believe me, we have many. We all know this, right? But climate change is the issue of our generation and generations to come. Certainly, I'm a parent. I have 2 kids, and I know without any doubt that climate change is going to impact their lives in incredibly profound ways. And what we're doing right now and not doing will certainly impact them as well. So how are we reacting as a society? And by we, I mean America, because Canada and America are implementing very different policy solutions at the moment. We are embracing protectionism. We are imposing tariffs. Today, I woke up to a Times headline that Trump has said we will no longer talk to Canada about those tariffs that we're putting on you all. And so that's sort of at the national level. At state and more local levels, we're seeing incredible revolt against taxation, specifically property taxation. We've got active discussions everywhere from Florida up to Maine, with something as dramatic as completely doing away with the property tax. So we are in a particular moment in history. As I said, there's definitely some parallels between now and the progressive era when George was alive. Um, and as an organization dedicated to George's ideas, I think that gives us some opportunities, right? Us as an organization, us as a society, us as a species. Perhaps this is our moment to finally really carefully listen to George. And that is what our organization is dedicated to doing, is to ensure that his ideas continue to be heard and are adapted for today's circumstances. So the opportunities that we see right now, at least in the US, are by and large at the state, county, and more local levels. We're not No one is really getting much traction at the federal level, and by no one, I clearly someone is, but the kind of policies that we want to see implemented. But happily, the policy that we want to see implemented the most, which is a land value tax, is a local policy. And so there's an incredible groundswell of interest and opportunities to work on this policy. And so my colleague Steve is going to talk in just a couple minutes about what we're doing there. And then I think the other thing that we're being very mindful of is, the pendulum swings, right? And so we have swung very, very far in one direction. At some point, and I don't know what that point will be, we will swing back. And so how do we position ourselves as an organization and as, would-be thought leaders to have the conversation informed by the ideas of Henry George when we finally do make that swing back? Steve, if you could go forward one more time. So what does that look like right now in terms of our programming? As I said, we have 4 program areas, and essentially what we're doing is really looking to hone all of the work that we do in support of this kind of near-term initiative of local focus alongside a longer term game of teeing ourselves up and society as a whole to do better when we have the opportunity. So in the area of scholarships and fellowships, we grant scholarships nationally. We also have a partnership with Rutgers University, which is local to us here in New Jersey. Part of that is educating college students about George, about his ideas. It's plain and simple, right? And we select students who are in disciplines where we anticipate that that knowledge is going to be directly useful to them. People who we see as future community leaders, future elected officials. So we're talking about policy students, planning students, economists, people of all types of disciplines, but where we see them gaining that knowledge and bringing it to bear in the world as they mature, as they become the leaders of our society. Happily, we are seeing that as the scholars continue out into the world, and as we're partnering sort of the scholarship effort with research grant making, that faculty are starting to incorporate in a much more substantive way the teachings of George into their actual curriculum, which we're really excited about because I honestly thought that would take longer for that to start to be taken up in the way that we're already starting to see. Our library, that is sort of a place of preservation, but it's also a place of innovation. So obviously we have all of George's works and all of his sort of contemporary scholars' works, but we're also continually looking to grow the collection and to bring new viewers and new folks into conversation with us. Just recently, we completed the Mason Gaffney collection and archive. So I suspect we all know who Mason Gaffney is. That work was supported by the Danica Foundation. And so we now have freely accessible to anybody in the world, not only all of Mason's publications, but all of his class notes, his correspondence. So it is really super comprehensive. And we're actively doing outreach to economics and historical societies to really try to engender some more scholarship in that area using that collection. We're also working on a progressive era cartoon collection, which is obviously focused on Henry George, but that's going to include lesson plans for younger students as well, so really high school and above. And we have some great connections into that community, and so every expectation that that's going to be taken up there as well. And the last thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about is our research grant making, because this is a really nice kind of instrumental way to incentivize the folks who are the thought leaders to think about George, to bring his ideas into conversation, into interrogation in modern context. And so through that program, we have or are currently funding a number of projects on land value tax, on the implications of its implementation, and even simulation models that are designed to sort of understand what it would do in various contexts, including California, should Prop 13 ever go the way of the dodo. Um, we also support work on sort of related topics. So scarce resource sharing, for example, in Arizona, water in Phoenix. How the heck do you even do that, right? So that's a research grant that we recently wrapped. And we're supporting new publications about Henry George. We have a PI right now at the University of Pennsylvania who's working on a book about Henry George's thoughts and publications. So the research grants, the scholarships, and the fellowships, and the library all kind of work in a complementary fashion, and they're all national in focus, to keep the conversation going, to introduce new people to Henry George, and all of that is super important. And then our last program area is really where the rubber meets the road for us, because this is where we are doing original research into tax policy and getting into communities all over this country to talk about that work, advocate for the adoption of LVT, and really ensure that policymakers understand it. They have all the information that they need about implications, and that outreach is being done well. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Steve Hoskins. Steve is the person who kind of does the majority of that. And so he's going to walk us through a little bit of what that looks like.
Thanks, Josie, and hi, everybody. Apologies I couldn't be there with you in person today. I'm in the later stages of a marital visa here in the US, and a New Zealander with the same status as me went to drop her kids off at the Vancouver airport a month ago, drove back on the same day, and got thrown in an internment camp for 3 weeks. So I didn't feel like a trip to Ottawa was quite worth it today, unfortunately. And I've been reminded by Vernon, who's our director of content, that those of you who are here on Zoom, you can add your questions into the chat as we go through the event. He does a really good job of collecting those up and then making sure we answer them at the end. So yeah, feel free to do that all the way through the later presentations as well. As Josie said, I direct the community research and advocacy portion of our work. And I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of how that all sits today, yeah, and so this kind of moment that we're in. I have no idea why that picture has just decided not to work. That's very odd. Can you folks see all three of the images? It seems like it.
We can
Okay,
see
I'll just
two
talk
of
as if you
them.
can. Okay.
Yeah, we can only see two, but it's okay. We'll
I
listen.
don't know why that's happened. Yeah. So, look, yeah, as Josie's rightly raised, we're in a particular political moment here in the US. And in some ways that delivers a lot of advantages, and then obviously a lot of downsides as well. But sort of one of the benefits of this moment is that communities are really looking for local sources of funding to replace lost funds from federal programs. And that sort of naturally turns them towards interest in property taxes, and land value tax can be advocated as part of that. And sort of critically, the property taxes go through a kind of cycle here in the US, where people get more and more fed up with them. Then they try and abolish them, which is what Ron DeSantis is doing on the top right of our screen there. And then inevitably they commission these, yeah, sort of property tax task force working group. And they're tasked always with the same impossible task, which is to protect middle-class homeowners from the burden of property taxes, while also making sure that programs are, critical services and infrastructure are fully funded. Now, those two things can't be achieved. You have to kind of collect taxes if you want to fund those services. But these commissions provide a really great opportunity for us to get a foot in the door and explain how a land value tax achieves all of the goals of what people are trying to achieve with their tax system. So they want them to be more progressive. They want their tax system to not penalize productive work and investment. They want when the local government spends on municipal infrastructure, and that raises land values. They want to capture some of that value back and keep their transit well funded, those sorts of things. So yeah, there's kind of there's a lot to be depressed about at the current moment that we're in, but also some real opportunities in this particular moment for us. In terms of the geography of our advocacy, I can't see on your screen. Is the map of the US visible underneath that? Can I get a head nod from Brendan or? Okay, it looks like some folks can see it. Imagine a US map if you can't see it. We sort of have this general typology of the interest that comes to us from different communities. The superstar cities, which are demarcated by the yellow stars here, they're typically struggling with the stubborn problem of vacancies. And this is kind of the same thing that Henry George was looking at 150 years ago. You know, very expensive city, desperate need for more housing, but the land just remains vacant, you know, and they're kind of asking why and what can we do about it? And that goes, you know, the conversation inevitably goes vacancy taxes, underutilization, and then land value tax. The orange circle there is kind of the Sun Belt and second tier sort of cities in the US, where, you know, I think a lot of growth that's not being accommodated in the superstar cities is being pushed, you know, into places in the Sun Belt. We're talking like Phoenix, Atlanta, Houston, Austin. And then, you know, Richmond, Virginia is one of these as well, where the cities then kind of go, you know, how can we cope with this population growth? How can we make sure that we build the housing we need? And certainly, you know, how do we rezone our land use policies to accommodate that growth? And again, this is a great opportunity to talk about, you know, land value uplift from zoning, ways to capture that value, and the way to make sure that your tax system doesn't, you know, penalize people who are wanting to build that much needed housing. And then lastly, the red circle there is the Rust Belt. And these cities are typically struggling with problems of sort of persistent blight, a real struggle to attract investment dollars, and you know, looking to put, you know, get that vacant land sort of put to a better societal use, either with housing and investment, but also sometimes just with it being upkept more. And so this is a great opportunity. You might have seen Mayor Duggan in Detroit. You know, his whole narrative was from blight to beauty. So this is kind of the geography of the way that we talk about land value tax in different parts of the US at the local level. In terms of cultivating the coalition, this is something that we, you know, have been doing, you know, ad hoc until now and are starting to really solidify. Again, it's, you know, there's a great moment for this. So sort of starting on the right-hand side here, we tend to find that our strongest supporters are from sort of pro-housing and urbanist groups, represented there by Strong Towns. These are groups that, yeah, like their kind of medium density, mixed use urbanism, you know, publicly funded transit networks, these sorts of things. Tied in with that are unions, and in particular transit unions. They love, you know, that land value tax is a great way to ensure that their jobs and their services are well funded with the land value they create. And then on the top right is the Sierra Club is an environmental organization here, and the environmental case for land value tax is also, you know, a very critical component of interest that we sort of experience coming from different groups of people and where we find our allies. And then on the left there, this is an alliance that we just announced last week, is between our organization and YIMBY Action, which is one of the kind of coordinating organizations for YIMBYs here in the US. And we tend to find that YIMBYs are our strongest allies, our strongest soldiers, and actually have a lot of the existing infrastructure for advocacy for land value tax and land value tax-esque policies. So this is sort of a very fertile territory for us to get endorsements for land value tax, you know, on websites and platforms, but then also to kind of work with a close set of allies there on Georgist advocacy alongside YIMBY advocacy. And so to turn to the research side of things, I think something that we're experiencing with this kind of new wave of interest in land value tax, even though it's motivated by, you know, a lot of the same things that Henry George was observing in his time, we find that it's not very helpful to come into that conversation leading with Henry George. people's eyes tend to glaze over a little bit if we kind of start with the kind of historical explanation. I think that maybe we start to come across a little bit as cultists, which might be true, but I try and keep that on the down low. So yeah, we kind of tend to come in and we're just talking in the terms of policy wonkery. We're looking at optimal tax systems. We're looking at dealing with the problems that people are facing in their communities right now on the ground. And one thing we've really experienced is that running the numbers, coming equipped with the results of what a land value tax is going to look like and what it's going to do in their community is a really fantastic way to get into a lot of rooms. And so this is really my bread and butter, and this is what we do a lot of work on. Typically, the types of questions that people have, the first one from policymakers is always who's going to pay more and who's going to pay less. So we run those numbers for them and we tell them what it's going to look like. They want to know why. So, the storytelling component of this is really important. If this image is not showing for you, it's a vacant parking lot downtown Denver, surrounded by, large residential and commercial buildings. And we like to be able to explain this is why parking lots are going to be paying a lot more tax under the system. And this is why multifamily housing and, productive land uses tend to get a tax cut. So telling the story of land value tax works really well. People want to know whereabouts in the city is the tax burden going to shift to and from. And then is it progressive is a really big one as well. And sometimes a bit of policy design is needed to kind of make sure that the goals of progressivity are achieved. Insofar as, some American cities still have a lot of low-income people living in very high-value locations as a kind of historical legacy. And so sort of workarounds are needed to accommodate that issue. So yeah, this is kind of a big part of our research/advocacy work, is running these numbers and communicating them to people. And then just to sort of talk a little bit more broadly about Georgia's land value tax research in general. So Josie, already explained our grant programs and our scholarship programs, which is one way that we, like to support, interested researchers and students who might be, find Georgia's ideas appealing. But we are starting to sort of dip our toes into taking a bit more of a proactive role here and kind of setting the stage for, okay, where is the frontier of land value tax research? What are the questions that we don't have answers to? What are the ones where we maybe have a paper or two that we can wave around, but the evidence is not that strong? And what are the areas, where urban economists and historians and lawyers and urban planners, they have some things right, but they're not quite getting the gist of kind of what land value tax can do in their field as well. So this article down here, and we'll try and share this in the chat in a moment, was sort of taking a stock of where that sort of situation is with research. And we're going to be sort of more active in soliciting proposals from researchers in those areas. And the Henry George Foundation, the one here is the one in Great Britain, with whom we've recently started collaborating on sort of advising them about, how they can direct some of their research funds towards areas of interest that are both relevant and important for our work, and then also serve both the North American and a British advocacy objective. And I'm sure that, I think Canada fits nicely between those two. So yeah, that's a sort of a nice summary of the type of work that we're doing. I'll invite you to check out our website for more information about us as an organization. Again, I'll put the links in the chat here in a moment. And then the QR code on the bottom left there is for just a little form. If any of you are interested in hearing about our advocacy work and getting involved, I guess if you're Canadian, maybe you should work through HGF Canada. But if you're a researcher and you're interested in sort of being involved in some of those research networks, or hearing about our grant programs or pitching us on your sort of proposal that's relevant to our work, please do fill that out. Let us know who you are and where you are, and we'll have a conversation. So yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the presentations and to discussing your questions.
Well, thank you, Josie and Steve. We'll take maybe 5 minutes if there's any questions on this particular topic. Josie and Steve. Is there any questions from the floor here? There's one to John.
I'm a fan of George Lakoff, and he has this famous phrase around tax relief is a frame of like disease. You inflict a tax, so tax relief is an relief from an affliction. And so the notion of land value tax still sort of focuses on an individual parcel. And for me, my modest understanding of land value tax is that it comes from the community. The value of the land comes from what's around it. So I think it might be useful to sort of reframe it to community value tax, that, you know, what you own gets its value from what's around it, not from what you own. That might be a useful part of reframing the narrative.
So, Josie and Steve, did you get that question? It was,
We did,
how do you explain, you know, we talk about a site value, which is individual, and an individual pays the tax, but we look at it bigger, that the community is involved in that. And John's asked, how do you phrase that narrative, you know?
Yeah. So here's what I'd say. Yes, people don't like talking about taxes. They don't like the word taxes, right? That's immediately off-putting. So there's a lot of different language that we use and others, you know, in the US who work on this use. So, for example, total building exemption is one that I know the Center for Land Economics, and we, you know, borrow from them as well, because everybody likes the idea of an exemption, right? We don't like to be taxed. We like to be excluded. And total building exemption, wow, that sounds fantastic, right? But that is an LVT. It's a total building exemption. And there's other terms too, and we talk a lot about value capture, which in the US anyway is one of these, you know, I'm going to say buzzwords, but that makes it, that sounds diminishing, and it isn't. People really care about that, in particular in electeds and planners and those kinds of local decision makers really care about capturing community created value. So that's really a big part of the conversation. And I can just speak for myself. I do the LVT dog and pony more times than I care to admit. So I have a pretty, at this point, standard presentation, and it's sort of the basis of it is this notion of community created value. And I'll say, I've talked to a lot of people for whom LVT might be vaguely familiar, but feel pretty intimidating, or it's a complex thing that I don't necessarily have my arms fully around. But when you start there, kind of start with this notion of natural resources not being the product of human hands, right? And that value that embeds in land is community created value, and that LVT will allow you to capture that and put it back for public uses. People follow that very, very readily. So I think that that's kind of what you were driving at. But yeah, terminology matters, and getting people on that sort of foundational path of this is about what we do together and, you know, making all of our lives better. That seems to tend to resonate. I don't know, Steve, did you have things you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, Ed Dodson has actually just put in the chat what I was about to say, which is that the other framing is land value return, and we do try and center that sometimes. I think community value return, it's a little bit too abstracted from the fact that the community value is fixing into the land, and it's the land rent that's kind of dragging, you know, the bottom end of society into grinding poverty. So yeah, land value return, I think, really captures the idea that we're returning to the community the value that it creates, and it is into the land that value fixates. So yeah, we sort of try and play around with these different framings. I think it often depends on the political context. Different types of communities are more motivated by the idea of exempting, you know, building values, or, you know, sharing community values. And I think being kind of nimble and adjusting your rhetoric for different audiences is a really important thing that frankly that we need to get better at as well, as we reach out to some sort of new kind of political groups. Yeah, thanks for the question.
May I add something to the?
Yes, we got one question. Do you want to come up so that we can get your voice?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a good memory. I might feel not. No, go on. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, to Rose, I'm one of the members of School of Economic Science, and I'm about to refer to work that I've done with the Progress and Poverty Institute in the past. On the question about vocabulary, I have the Progress and Poverty Institute to thank for a decision that we made at School of Economic Science very recently, which was to use some of their terminology in our strategic plan. The phrase land value return, I think, is a really great example of this vocabulary shift in action, moving away from the language of taxation, and people don't want taxes, don't want to be sold on it. Look at the failure of the carbon tax in Canada when it could have been sold to the public in any other, in any number of other ways, or, you know, carbon dividends, for example, might be one example of how that can be framed. But we've actually just written land value return, thanks to the Progress and Poverty Institute, into our strategic plan. I remember the meeting we had very recently where we were going over their work, and just immediately we just realized, is there a reason why we wouldn't immediately write this as a one-to-one replacement for the old land value tax moniker into our documents? We also have in our strategic plan at School of Economic Science some verbiage around proliferating a vocabulary of reform that clarifies the true sources of economic imbalance and makes their remedies self-evident. Providing a compelling moral frame is the trick that Henry George pulled off back in the 19th century that got him thus far. Big thanks to my colleague Liam Wilkinson for nailing the phrasing of that line in our plan. And a third answer I can give you is an article I was actually commissioned to write on behalf of the Progress and Poverty Institute, back then the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, about carbon pricing and using that as a vehicle for getting through to the public about the topics. I experimented in that article a lot with emphasizing the differing nature of what we're proposing as sources of government revenue that are different from conventional taxation, and just refusing to refer to them as taxes any longer. Resource pricing can be a useful frame. Returns can be another useful vocabulary choice. And this is very much something that should evolve as we discover new useful devices and better frames. It's something that we shouldn't ever consider finished. But there are a few different answers for you. If you want to read my article, it's titled Carbon Consensus. It's still up there on the Progress and Poverty Institute website, and you can see some of the devices that I alighted upon that in that article. And yeah, thank you for listening.
All just text, yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. We got time for one more question. Is there any questions online? I'm not seeing any in my, because we'll have a question and answer at the end. If there's no more questions, then I'll go on to our next speaker. Okay.
Would you want to come up with this or the?
Question directed, I think, mostly to Steve, which is when you're talking to municipalities, and you kind of alluded briefly that sometimes the picture isn't as rosy for historical reasons or whatever the case may be. There are some communities that would look like they aren't going to do as well off in the first blush or during the transition to municipal leaders. What are the design parameters of the LVT or the associated policies that would perhaps remedy some of those less than desirable effects that you find are resonating with municipalities? You know, what are you telling a councillor when it looks like that a certain community actually will face a higher tax burden?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate that. So one that we always start with is that you should keep your existing exemption / abatement sort of protection programs. These are typically for veterans, low-income retirees, low-income people in general, disabled people. We typically say, you know, keep those in place because those are designed to protect people who perhaps can't meet a rapidly rising property tax burden. The second side of this is we just generally advocate for a kind of low-income homeowner and renter tax credit. It's common for those to only exist for homeowners, and we always say it should go to the renters as well. Doesn't really make sense that renters pay their full rent, but the homeowners get a nice carve out for their property taxes. And so typically this is kind of like, if your income's below and your assets are below a certain level, you get a certain dollar amount of exemption from your property taxes or from your income taxes. Thirdly is to have just a kind of a flat value of land that is exempt on all properties, like a certain dollar amount per property. And this kind of generally makes the land value tax more progressive in general, and typically does it has more impact for those people at the bottom end of the scale. I'm trying to think of what else I'm missing in there. I think the only other angle of this is that there are often crocodile tears being wept sort of on behalf of the poor, retired widow who lives in a home that's, unfortunately, it's now worth $2 million. This is the worst thing in the world. And these get used to advocate for sort of fully exempting retirees from property taxes, wholesale. And we typically try to advise, okay, don't do that. You can have deferral programs where people can say, okay, I can't pay my taxes right now, but set up a lien against the property value that'll accumulate over time and then gets paid when the property is sold. That is a great way to make sure that you still get your revenue from very high value properties that are owned by people in those demographic groups, but that they aren't sort of being, immediately taxed out of house and home while also being, socioeconomically disadvantaged. So those types of approaches, the specifics depend on the place, of course, but that's how we tend to go about it.
I would just add one other thing, and everything Steve said is spot on, but what we're seeing in some communities, places like Memphis and Minneapolis, a municipality-wide LVT is not the best choice for them for any number of reasons. And so then it's a more geographically narrow implementation. So, in the case of Minneapolis, they're looking at, office buildings that post-COVID, post-George Floyd, they just don't have the occupancy rates that they need. Can a targeted LVT help with that? In Memphis, it has to do with authority to, impose certain types of taxation, uniformity clauses, all of that. And they're actually looking at their business improvement districts as a sort of pre-existing, locations where they have more autonomy, they have more flexibility to tax in different ways. So that's another thing. And then I think the one other thing I would add is that, not an LVT, but similarly intentioned policies could be a fit, something like a vacancy tax. And so, I think, and this is why it matters so much where you are and who you're talking to, because the constraints and the opportunities look very different from one place to another. But you're absolutely right in asking that question, that because there are winners and losers, and because every place is different, we can never universally say that LVT is going to be a good fit no matter what. And that's why Steve's work to run the numbers is always our jumping off point, so that we know before we ever open our mouths what this really is going to look like for them.
Well, thank you, Josie. Thank you, Steve. We'll go on now. Thank you for your questions. I don't think we've got any online, but like I say, we'll come back later on. Could you just pass me that the books there? Yeah, I'll just take one. Thank you. So our next guest, lots of people know Francis K. Peddle. Everybody calls him Frank. Frank is the executive director of the Henry George Foundation of Canada, Professor Emeritus at Dominican University College, Ottawa, a retired tax lawyer, and past president of the Robert Clackenbach Foundation, and the co-editor of the Annotated Works of Henry George. And I'm holding up Volume 2, Progress and Poverty. And Frank and Bill should be very proud of that. And Josie also for finishing off the project when she took over as executive director. So without ado, Frank will be speaking on the work of the Henry George Foundation of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. And it's nice to hear from our American partners. One can only hope that the internet doesn't go dark today in the US and we never hear from them again, given the relationship between our two countries. I'm going to talk about the future today mostly, although I know we're here celebrating the near anniversary of the Henry George Foundation of Canada, which was set up, incorporated in 1930, and it is the actual centenary of the Progress and Poverty Institute in the US. So we're comparable age, both of our organizations. The philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, a well-known German philosopher, warned us about two things. It is not the business of philosophy to speculate about the future, and it should resist the temptation to be edifying. I intend to violate both of these strictures today. First of all, economics, once an edifying discipline, has descended into an unrelenting reverberation of numbing cliches and meaningless algebraic nostrums. I am reminded of what George Galloway, who was a politician you might some know, controversial politician, once said about Christopher Hitchens, another controversial journalist and writer. And I quote from George Galloway, "We have witnessed something extraordinary in natural history, the metamorphosis of a butterfly into a slug." If the term edifying hints at anything like the ethical or the normative or the luminous, then economics is overdue, I should say, for a refresh. As for the second Hegelian prohibition, what does today's economics tell us or can tell us about the future? Not very much, I'm afraid, because it is now too busy dallying in the behavioral, the psychological, the sociological, the data-driven, the historical, and yes, the political. Humans are irrational, but sometimes rational. Either trait is no sure predictor. We are able to go to the moon because we can predict the future, a big part of science, and we do this with astonishing precision. That humans behave badly in the process is not the fault of any scientific prediction. Economics is the science of wealth. When I asked around last year about the possibility of having a national conference here in Canada on the nature and meaning of wealth, not only was the silence deafening, but Arnold Toynbee's comment, and this is in his lectures on industrial revolutions, about the bitter argument, I quote again, the bitter argument between economists and human beings echoed through the silence. No one wants to talk about this. Henry George in his day and now has many things to say about the future. They are not what you might think. They are crafted to align economics with the welfare of the human condition. Now, about the past a bit. The future imaginaries invariably suppose past narratives. The aggrandizement of the past, glorious, abundant, and pure, is the current political mantra. We've heard, make such and such great again, right? A glorious past is not something that can be invoked here today. Henry George himself was for a time a member of the, I should say this, the Unemployed Philosophers Guild, but he was doing other things as well. The history of his ideas is spotted and uneven, to say the least, but the spots depend on one's devotions. Georgists often see a tale of civilizational implosion and nowhere to go but failure. Others catalog a story of modest incursions into the green fairways of economic justice. I could add today that the widespread reduction over time in the 20th century until now, I'm saying roughly from the end of the Second World War until now, of tariffs between most countries has a long lineage traceable back to protection of free trade, which George published in 1886. But uncoupling this from land value taxation has done little for the uplifting of wages. At another level, the resilience of property taxation, even though under attack, and perfect though it may be in its current form, is testimony to intuitions that all have about the fairness of capturing some economic rent by the public authorities, an echo of the sovereign's remedy of progress and poverty. However you view it, these ideas do not go away, do not fail to resurface in some form, nor do they fail to inspire in varying degrees of intensity. Some histories. Henry George Foundation of Canada, founded and incorporated on June 19th, 1930, 8 months after Black Thursday, October 24th, today, by the way, 1929, the great crash that is usually seen as the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Coincidentally, this is exactly 50 years after the publication of Progress and Poverty in October 1879. And not to be too macabre about it, the month of October is also Henry George's date of death on October 29th, 1897, I should say. So feeling a little tremulous being here in the month of October today. Who were the 12 founders and original incorporators of the foundation? Well, you probably haven't heard of any of them. What would they have thought today of us gathered here so long after that? The fact that we're here actually would be a bit of an inspiration to them. There was Ernie Farmer. He was a musician. There was Stanley Tizer Floyd, who was a dentist. There was James Tully, civil servant. Alan Cameron Thompson, a manufacturer. Arthur Roebuck, solicitors. Some were affably described in the founding document as just gentlemen. Roebuck went on to be have a notable career in law and politics, becoming Attorney General of Ontario and later a senator. As trades and professions go, this is a broad section of society, though lacking in gender diversity, obviously, despite George's considerable contributions to the advancement of universal suffrage and the vote to women. The purposes and the objects of the foundation are straightforward. To promote an understanding and acceptance of the principles enunciated by Henry George in his book entitled Progress and Poverty, and in his other writings. We should not forget about his other writings. They're all over there. 100 years ago in the 1920s, everybody like today wanted to climb aboard the asset ladder, gobbling up property and stocks, usually on newfound credit, to get out of the vice grip of trying to earn a living wage. It is alleged that the current historically high valuations in the equity and property markets are primarily spurred on by riotous investment and spending in the AI, that is the stochastic parrot industry and sector, or it might be said that the retiring baby boom generation, my generation, allegedly the richest cohort in history, is now consuming and spending its enormous stores of economic rent. Everyone is riddled with foreboding that something awful is going to happen with the current confluence of circumstances, a confluence frequently and accurately predicted by Georgists over the generations. The peak of the celebrated 18-year real estate cycle arrives next year, 2026. So we are ready once again. Are we ready once again? Were we ready once again to step into the breach and try our hand at meaningful prediction and future imaginaries? So here's some futures. Were George alive 100 years later, would he be sanguine about anything? Probably not, mainly because his landlordism, now known as the rentier society, still prevails. Asset holders are winning, wage earners are going nowhere. The degradation of the human condition, no living wages, no economic security, no decent shelter, pervasive indebtedness, intergenerational inequity, institutional decay, and I should say data poundage, that's a phrase I'll explain offline maybe, has for very few been noticeably lessened. The self-regulated market with its commodity fictions of labor, land, and money, all richly exposed, by the way, in Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation of 1944, continues to call out for the Georgist paradigm, namely that if you allow nature to be cordoned off for a few, and nature can take many forms, then everything else becomes a purchasable good or service. All is for sale and purchase. Prices are fixed to everything. The relation between society and economics severely warped. Human capital, natural capital, and the granddaddy of them all, money capital, are as much perverse fictions for George as they are for Polanyi. The economic narrative for the rest of the 21st century, in all likelihood, will have a set, though, of predictable and foreseeable contours. A way to think about these future contours is in terms of a phrase that I lifted from Jonathan White, anticipated legitimacies. And what I mean by that is if failures of the present encourage us to consent to future ideals. And I'll give you an example of that. There are many, but politically, if you lose an election, that's okay, because you will think, I can participate in an election in 4 years, and I might win then. So the system still has legitimacy for you, right? The system holds its legitimacy, even if empirically you get occasionally whacked. Economically, extreme inequality and wage suppression are spurs to the ideal of reform, if you believe in a system of fair distribution and reward. So I think it's best to think of George's last great work, The Science of Political Economy, as providing the anticipatory legitimacy for the economics of the next 100 years. The philosopher biographer George Geiger, in 1933, in his biography of George, took it as George's ultimate attempt to fashion a unified and comprehensive system of thought. George had hoped it would be the crowning masterpiece of his life. The science of political economy, unlike the more celebrated Progress and Poverty, did not play a significant role in the progressive and reformist agendas of the early 20th century. It contains no revolutionary mobilizations against ravenous landlords or greedy rent seekers. It envisaged a pure theoretical benchmark for political economy outside the turbulent world of human society and institutional change. Therein lies, strangely enough, the legitimate source of the collective agency and individual commitment necessary for the coming economic and fiscal reforms. And they will come, because the current arrangements are unsustainable. As a treatise on the means to the satisfactions of wealth, the science of political economy stands on its own. Time spent detecting the continuities between George's initial Berkeley lecture, where he first used the phrase political economy, the study of political economy in 1877, and this posthumous work 20 years later. You spend a lot of time there, you'll really get to know his life. You look at it in terms of the two bookends there. Is rewarded with an understanding of how it capstones George's intellectual life. Everything flows from his basic insights, which originally came to him in the 1870s about human production and its relation to nature and land. Through best-selling books, pamphlets, newspaper articles, and endless speeches in numerous countries, George stayed consistent to his economics and moral judgments, as did few other economists or reformers of the Gilded Age. Progress and Poverty is George's clarion call for an economically just society. The political economy is George's final and definitive theoretical response to that call. Together, these two works melded the often contentious realms of ethics and economics into a unified vision, realistically ideal, not phantasmagorically utopian, like most 19th century utopias and uchronias. George was not the only philosopher of economics in the 19th century to attempt such a broad-scale reconciliation of the moral and material sides of existence. Yet more than any other political economist of the time, his life's achievement inspired the most far-reaching and long-lasting movements for reform across multiple disciplines, social groupings, and nations. And all of you here today are certainly representative of that. Science of political economy sought to set standards for judging human economic institutions. It said very little about how to realize those judgments. So it's a frustrating book in that way. Do not therefore think that this austere treatise says nothing about the future. The single tax and land value taxation, the historical terms associated with George, are barely mentioned at all. The only call to arms consists in a skeletal form of a projected new physiocracy. George tantalizes us with an illusion about a future book to underwrite the coming economic rebellion, clearing the undergrowth, vivisecting poor logic, holding it up to the icons of political economy to respectful scrutiny. Therein lies the luxuriant detail of the science of political economy. George helps us read better the classical economists. He more than hints at what we should stay away from in the new scholasticism of his day, pretty much like the inchoate mysticisms of modern economics. History may shape the crevices and outcrops of political economy, but the philosophy of economics must remain transhistorical, with its theory of wealth anchored necessarily in future time. This is because wealth theory and its accompanying theory of value is futural. The value of something lies not in the past exertion it represents, but in the relief of future human exertion. And that's a really important point. The whole direction of wealth creation is futural. And cost of production theories and labor theories of values miss that. George's last work is also his greatest pedagogical gift. This is another prime directive for the next 100 years. He originally conceived the science of political economy as a basic primer on economics, a popular offering in his time, despite the still nascent character of economics as an academic discipline. Given the educational exhortations of the Berkeley lecture, George finally achieved at the end of his life an economic manual, or enchiridion, I like to say, for the channeling of the aspirations of youth. Convulsions in the body economic, like the tectonic shifts taking place today over economic and social inequality, often end up with even more perverse interferences with the laws of production and the laws of distribution. There is no guarantee in any revolution that the greater Leviathan will be left in better shape. Progress and poverty provided the remedy for detecting and eliminating distortions caused by human laws and institutions, attempting to bend or ignore the consequences of the privatization of economic rent. The science of political economy articulates the standards for economic life that can be thought of in any individual way. It provides us with the blueprint for an economically just society before the institutions of law, politics, and higher learning immeasurably compound the exertions necessary to see clearly the foundations of the body economic. Now I go through 10, and I can only do this briefly here, 10 what I call reconciliations that will be necessary in the next 100 years. No false modesty here, in order to advance society and this philosophy. The first one is, and the reason why is because we're stuck in this trade-off economics. You know, we either have equity or we have efficiency. If we tax too much, we destroy efficiency. But we need to tax, you know, it's sort of supposedly the price we pay for civilization and so on. But if we go get rid of all tax, then efficiency will improve it. All of this stuff. George doesn't think like that. He does not think of trade-offs. So everything I'm talking about today is an attempt in George to transcend these trade-offs and incorporate them in a complementary way. And the first and biggest one, in my view, is the trade-off that we always talk about or always hear about in economics today between equity and efficiency. George's position is that both equity and efficiency are fundamentally rational and consistent. They can be thus harmonized. But to treat one as human, the other as natural, is to set up a false dichotomy, which leads to an illusory division between ethics and economics. That's sort of the main gist of his critique of John Stuart Mill, which occupies a big part of the science of political economy. Second one is a trade-off between demand side and supply side economics. You hear this a lot. A social order which avoids the privatization of rent and the socialization of income from the labor and capital would, for George, stimulate both the demand side and the supply side, thus avoiding perpetual rift in modern economics between Keynesian and neo-Keynesian style manipulation of aggregate effective demand, and those who follow Say's law, which says the supply creates its own demand, or in other words, there'll be no long-term glut of goods. George, by the way, rejects the theory of that overproduction or underconsumption are the causes of industrial depressions. It avoids the conflict between labor and capital, which was one of the big ones in the 19th century, of course. And it does that by, of course, changing the whole terms of reference to rent and away from labor and capital. And it does this by down taxing labor and capital. It stimulates both investing and the saving. You always see again, you know, this so-called tug of back and forth between both. That stimulating investing is usually the rationale for untaxing businesses, while stimulating savings and capital formation is generally the rationale for consumption taxes. And if you talk to any economist today, it's always, you know, the back and forth between consumption taxes and income taxes. George Lucas would transcend both of these things and say that this type of distinction is artificial. Most of it stems, as some of you know, from the neoclassical revolution or devolution, I might say, the devolution from the butterfly to the slug from classical economics to neoclassical economics in the late 19th and early 20th century. It stimulates, therefore, both investing and saving. Urban sprawl versus urban densification. Again, another in the trenches, all-out warfare that we come across in many other disciplines, urban planning and things of that sort. It restrains urban deterioration while stimulating urban renewal. Another one where you get that sort of the old and the new type thing. Tax abatements and enterprise zones. Well, yeah, we'll keep them, but you know, we don't like them. Because all they do is shift taxation to the people who actually have to pay, and it shifts more taxation on our current system, of course, to labor and capital. So that's not really a good idea. Public transport deficits versus self-sufficiency in public transportation. Again, you know, we live here in Ottawa. We all know about the, shall we say, the deficiencies of the LRT, our public transportation rail network. And of course, because they don't scoop up enough land value around the transportation hubs, it's got a deficit, and we have ever-rising user fees. In a Georgia system, there would be no user fees in public transportation. It wouldn't be necessary. And then you can get philosophical and talk about reconciling communal rights and private rights, or restoring taxable capacity. Even you can talk about it constitutionally. We need a constitutional change in Canada that restores constitutional taxable capacity to municipalities, because they're creatures of provinces and the federal government. So to conclude then, the dialectic of struggle and conflict embedded in this economics of trade-offs will undoubtedly mark the empirical history of the 21st century. Transcending those trade-offs in an economics of abundance will also remain a pervasive ideal of the future. To finish with a little anecdote, the famous cellist Pablo Casals, when asked why he still practices 3 hours a day at the age of 95, responded, "I think I am making progress." Though future Georges, through future Georges laboring in the vineyards, I am confident that the Henry George Foundation of Canada at the tender age of 95 and the Progress and Poverty Institute will once again gather in 100 years to document and celebrate their achievements, traditions, and future imaginaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I did see a hand go up for a question. Is there an online question?
Yeah, we have one. Frank, is there a written version of that available to everybody?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Where can they find that maybe, guys?
We'll get it posted. I'll see if we want to put it on Commonwealth or on the Henry George Foundation. We'll have it. We'll get it up on the internet pretty soon. But the written version's in my hand here. So.
And maybe we can get Josie to put it in the archives as well.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for that question, online question from the person who put that in. Do we have a question? We have Ken. Do you want to come up, Ken?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that, Frank. Hello, everybody. Ken Yang from Commonwealth Canada. Congratulations on the centenary and the near centenary of these two organizations. If you could speak to the founders, what would you tell them that proponents of Henry George have achieved in the last 100 years, and maybe where we've fallen short, left something to be desired?
Well, as I said, the first thing I think I would say that we are still here and we're doing in a different form what they did. So there is a perpetuality, if you like, or an ongoing project here that's not going away. Because you can't organize society on the principles that we've organized it right now. And so I think we're keeping the light alive on the relationship between what we now think of as economics and society. And people, when I read people like Paul Yanni and that, who's not a George in a specific way, but he's talking exactly what George was talking about. No, the commodification of labor, the commodification of land and things like that. He knew these things. And he would talk a lot about, the shortcomings is probably the best word for it, the self-regulating market economy and that, and the abstractions around that. So I think we've kept it alive. Now, where have we failed? I think in a sense there will always be failure because there are conditions attaching to society and the human condition and how we relate to each other that will always have pushback against this ideal. But the key is that it's an ideal, okay? And that's where we have been successful. There's always, I look at younger people here today, that inspires me. I see a lot of stuff on the internet. And I think as long as that, and it's a realistic ideal as well, as long as that's alive and still going and we're able to try to shift, because we do scoop up rent in some ways. And in some ways that's because we don't really realize that that's the bulwark against maybe sometimes things really falling apart. And so I'm pretty confident in that sense that this ideal stays alive. And that's why I think they would be very pleased, the founders, to see us here today.
Is there any more questions from the floor? John, do you want to come up and just ask questions?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Democracy is a utopian project. I'm a fan of modern monetary theory, which has transformed my idea of what money is. It comes out of thin air and the state can never run out of it. And that's in turn led me to these questions of what are taxes for? It's not taxpayers' money that funds federal government expenditures. It's always new money. So taxes are a way of de-issuing currency and perhaps many other uses. So part of the revolution, I think, if we're going to look to the future, is a new form of relationship between municipalities, provinces, and the federal government that can issue currency and no one else can. Even banks are just chartered agents. So that means taxes are not for how we pay for things. So what are taxes for? And I think if we started looking at taxes aren't to pay for infrastructure, that might make the conversation around why we tax, what we're aiming to do with taxes, maybe a little bit clearer. If that's a question.
I'll just give a quick response to that, but it deserves a much bigger response. I think George had a very embryonic view of money. Okay, so it's simply for him a medium of exchange and a form of measurement. But we all know that the second part's a huge fiction because inflation, it just disappears. It's fiction, but it is a legal fiction. So he subscribed to the Aristotelian view of money. I mean, this is not a new view of money, that it's a legal fiction, right? The thing with, I think what you're trying to get at is recrafting our relationship to the community. And we only think of taxation in terms of individual things, or something I've done. That's because taxation is today always on an exigible event. I know that's a big term that you shouldn't use when you're out, doing advocacy, but it means there has to be a taxable event for taxation to have today. And that's always some individual thing. You work, you buy something, and so on. That's not there for George. And that's a big problem. People have trouble conceptualizing that because nothing has to happen in the George's system. It's on inert property. It's a stable thing like that. There will always be, as long as we are alive and producing, this store of wealth is there. And how you want to say, or how we're going to utilize that store of wealth is, of course, what the community decides on. And presumably that's the key basis of democracy. George, you view the body economic, and what goes on there is fundamental for the body politic, where democracy is going. So I think that what we want to say is, of course, it's these perverse tax systems and these perverse institutions that have such a difficult time thinking about this. So this is why we're always scraping around looking for some substitute term for land value taxation, because, it isn't a tax for George. He would not use that term, right? And also just, creating money out of thin air and fiat currencies and that. I mean, he didn't have a whole lot to say. He did say some stuff on commodity money versus credit money and so on. But, you obviously need credit for modern society. You have to stabilize that somehow, but only collecting the land rent would do that. That's why raising or lowering interest rates, yes, it does seem to have an effect on land values for sure. But it's really a symptom of what is more fundamental today. And it's not going to be the tariff wars going on right now that's going to bring down the house in the next year or two. It's going to be this 18-year cycle where land values get built up and people just can't sustain it. So, but anyway, it's a far bigger topic.
Thank you, John. And Steve wanted to add anything to Frank's comment just before we go to the next speaker.
I will avoid wading into modern monetary theory because I make it a habit of not touching macroeconomics. But one thing that came to mind for me was that I think we see echoes of the argument about, printing money will just create inflation. It gets paralleled in some of the conversations around UBI that are starting to emerge as as concerns about, you know, AI and loss of jobs are starting to take hold. And the argument in that forum is, well, if you give everybody a UBI, that's just going to raise prices, or in particular, it's just going to raise rents. And I think that the parallel there again is that, you know, UBI and land value tax go so well together precisely because it closes that loop, and the land value tax takes out of circulation the currency that's being injected by the UBI. And so simultaneously you're protecting against this possible adverse consequence, which is of, you know, oh, the landlords will just jack up the rent. By, you know, we have the solution to that, which is no, we're going to tax them if they do that. You know, they cannot, you know, UBI just becomes another way to sort of feed the rentier if it's not done through land value tax. And so yeah, I want to sort of applaud the work of Commonwealth Canada. I know that Ken's in the room, and I'm sure several of the rest of you are involved in that as well, because I think that connection is a really important one and is going to be increasingly politically important in the near term.
Thank you very much.
I'll move.
A well-known geologist. I talked about my love of the far north, the Arctic, and Frank loves the Yukon. He spent many years there and nature, so I imagine that the topic is close to him. But Frank Dion is here. He's a geologist activist. He's a teacher, a semi-retired teacher. He's past leader of the Green Party of Ontario, and he will be speaking on the impediments of the implementation of land value taxation at the different levels of government. So welcome, Frank.
Everyone, I just want to start to talk a minute about MMT, because that's a fascinating thing that came along, what, 10 years ago? I'm not even sure. Stephanie Kelton. And it is a lead-in for Georgists. It's a lot of things are a lead-in for Georgists, but we shouldn't forget about MMT, because MMT says if the economy is underproducing, it's the government's job to spend into the economy.
Balance the economy, not the budget.
Exactly. And if the economy is overproducing, it's the government's job to remove equity, to start taxing. But of course, we shouldn't tax, from a George perspective, we shouldn't tax our way back to a healthy economy. We should capture some of the economic rent of the gifts of nature. That's one term that no one mentions. A lot of people, a lot of Georgians talk about. The gifts of nature are what we should be capturing, the rental value of the gifts of nature. That gets you out of the whole rut of a tax, because a tax is when you take some of the money that someone earned, and capturing value is you're not taxing anyone, and no one can create nature. No one can create the gifts of nature. So you're capturing the rental value of the gifts of nature. So it's one way, it's yet another lead-in to economics. What happened with me, I guess I came of political age in the early 80s. I started hanging out in the peace movement in Toronto. That was the height of the Cold War. We were afraid, we knew there was many warheads pointed at Toronto. We could get blown to bits any second. It was a very tense time for many people, and myself included. And there was a very active, healthy peace movement in Toronto. I was a downtownie, so I started volunteering. And as soon as you start hanging out with some peace movement people, you start meeting all the politicos. There's this whole carousel of politicals. I heard that word yesterday, a carousel. There's a carousel, and they were like the nuts, fruits, and flakes, but then so was I. That's granola, but anyway. In the peace movement, it was everyone, the communists and the Marxists and the Marxist-Leninists, and then the feminists and the environmentalists and all the social justice people and the labor unions. And so what you do, it was like going to the CNE, where you have a shopping bag and you collect lit from everyone. And that's exactly what I did. Collected lit from all these amazing groups and strange people, the homosexuals, I shouldn't. The list goes on. And then I'd go home and take this whole bag and dump it on the floor and start reading. And one day, a couple of years in, I found a pamphlet from the Green Party that I'd never heard of. This is 1987. And I picked up this pamphlet and I checked all the boxes and I thought, yeah, that's me. I sent in my $10 and I never looked back. And so I clawed and gouged my way up to the top of the Green Party and became the leader in 1993. And I was leader till 2008 through 4 elections, I think it was. And in the meantime, I would also run federally because one of the criteria of being a respectable party was having a full slate or having a candidate in every riding. So that was important as well. So what happened was I started running in elections and learning about forestry and agriculture and transportation and every issue under the sun that the provincial government primarily was the jurisdiction of healthcare, of course, and education, of course. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. As leader, I got to travel around the province and meet Greens and go to organic farms and go to and talk to all kinds of forestry people. And it opened doors to all these people. So it became a fascinating experience for me. Plus, I knew as a leader, I had to become some kind of a cult figure, and that's not really in me. It certainly wasn't at the time, but I knew I had to build personal relationships with everyone. And so every time I went somewhere, I would work the room. That's, of course, a cliche, but it's so critical for political people. And as Georgists, we have to work the room too. We have to build personal relationships with all kinds of people, everyone we meet, because they will only listen to you if you have a personal relationship with them, pretty much. And they will only give you credibility. So that was all just the nuts and bolts of politics. But maybe 5 or 10 years went by in the Green Party and I realized, I thought, wait a minute, we don't even have an economic policy. We had no opinion on economics primarily, except we adopted the left wing economics, which unions were good and free trade was terrible. We hated Mulrooney, etc. So that was my economics. But at a certain point, I cottoned on to Georgism, a guy named John Fisher. He was a Green Party member and he would run as candidates. And so he would say, Frank, I want to talk to you about this. I said, no, I don't want to talk about it. You know the drill. Right? I don't want to talk about it. And then he said, Frank, you have to talk about it. And then finally I said, okay, I'll talk to you. And then he had what's called the Great Lesson. You know it, right? John Fisher's Great Lesson. He sort of drew cartoony type characters, but it was really good. And he invited me up to his cottage one time up in towards Owen Sound. And he said, I'm going to teach you the Great Lesson. And I thought, okay, fine. I thought I got a free weekend at a cottage. I thought that was worth it. So he went through it all, and it started making a lot of sense, and so much so that I started going down the Georgist rabbit hole, like another George over here. I was talking with him the other night, and he admitted fully that he's down the rabbit hole like a black hole. You can't see the light anymore. But then I started going to Georgist events, and it was fantastic, and it really informed my political life, and it helped me understand all about economics, of course, and it was not incompatible at all with the Green Party. So therefore, Georgist economics became, to me, the brains behind green economics, and that allowed me to be economically literate and to talk about economics, and I developed ideas about this, and there was other Georgists in the Greens as well. And so we would be ready to say something like, the Green Party would like to get rid of income taxes, or reduced, well, I would say get rid of, because I was a bit of an extremist. And then, and we would replace it with taxes on nature, which of course is not a tax, but anyway. So I would start saying more and more rash sort of types of things that other Green Party members considered very rash. So after doing this for about 3 or 4 years, I was defenestrated from the Green Party. They had to get rid of me because I wouldn't shut up about George. And it was too radical, right? I was just too radical for the Green Party. And the Green Party started getting bigger, and therefore they get less radical. They want it to be normal and attractive to the average voter. So, but by that time I was hooked. I was down the Georgist rabbit hole, and I have been doing Georgist activities for some 20 years now. So it's a great thing. I was going to start this speech with a little self-deprecating little rant or whatever, and it was going to start like, I am my own worst enemy. I'm my own worst enemy all the time. You wouldn't believe how long I keep doing things that I absolutely know I should quit doing. And you wouldn't believe how long I quit something which I absolutely know I should continue to do. And I look at all the facts and then I do the opposite. Why? Well, because it said to in the Bible, or my parents always did it that way, or it's the way it's done. So we get into all these habits and I'm thinking, I am my own worst enemy. I spend most of my time cutting off my nose to spite my face. And then guess what? We're all like that as a society, as a culture. We're religious, we're traditional, we're cultural, and a lot of these things tell us to do something which is against our self-interest. And we vote against our self-interest, you know, the list. And if I was to try to describe all the ways that I operate in my own self-interest, we'd be here all day. No, Occam's razor is not for me. I don't choose the simplest explanation for anything, and neither does anyone in society, and neither do we in economics. Georgism totally simplifies economics fabulously, but nobody can believe for a second that it is that straightforward and that simple. Unless you're a Georgist, you think tariffs are a good thing, like I did. The whole left wing, the labor movement, thought tariffs were great because it kept jobs locally. And I'm wondering now, I'm not connected to the labor union. I wonder if the left in Canada still holds that opinion. Does anybody know? Has the left in Canada, has the labor unions, are they still anti-free trade? I don't know. Nobody knows. We don't care. No, in a sense, because this whole thing was Trump, of course, and Carney is our great white knight. He's making us look great on the world stage, and he's talking in favor of free trade. And yet I haven't seen any labor unions protesting this or even writing a letter to the editor. They've gone to ground on it, or else they've actually figured it out. So that's maybe a good thing. I was basically assumed as I grew up into adulthood that poverty was normal, right? It's talked about in the Bible, the poor people and the Good Samaritan and Jesus was good to the poor and all this stuff, right? And everyone thinks that poverty is normal. Whereas when you become a Georgist, you realize, no, it's not normal. Everyone thinks, a lot of people think, and less happily, that climate change is a hoax. You know, there's still some of those characters around, but if you understand economics and Georgist, and if we do the revenue, the rental value of nature, you can see that there's an economic mechanism to address climate change. The other notion is I earned my wealth. I earned my wealth. You're too lazy to earn yours. That's not my problem. But the question is, we never examine how we earned our wealth. Did we earn it with work or through speculation, through real estate? I actually I'll confess, I've done extremely well in real estate. Not extremely well, don't worry. But I was raised on a dairy farm, and a farmer has 3 revenue streams. A farmer sells their produce and gets the revenue. A farmer is a laborer and collects their wages and the surplus of labor. And then a farmer is also a speculator because the farmer owns land and the land rises with it. So when I was a kid, I didn't realize that there were 3 revenue streams to being a farmer. And so I didn't want to be a farmer when I grew up, and I moved to Toronto and started renting. And 20 years later, my bank account was still 0 and I had 0 equity after 20 years in Toronto. I thought, well, that's pretty pathetic and sad, but I didn't have a clue why until I started hanging out with George. And so then I eventually ended up buying a house, and then I bought it at the beginning of the last boom in 1997, and it's done really well, relatively speaking. So another big bias that we have is that immigration is bad. They're stealing our jobs. Everyone thinks that. Not everyone, but darn near everyone thinks that. And we Canadians, we're bringing in like something a million people a year, close to it. And in normal years, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people. Yet there's a general consensus that they're stealing our jobs, right? This is a bizarre thing. And whereas as soon as you become a Georgist, then you realize that the more people you have, the better it is for everyone. You're not stealing jobs. because you realize through Henry George that jobs follow people. People don't follow jobs. As soon as you have 1 million people, you have 1 million jobs if you want them. There's work for everyone who wants to work in a functioning society without barriers. And Georgists know all these barriers to businesses, etc. So when you understand that, your anger against immigrants goes away because you welcome them, because they are helping you do so much better. My parents were immigrants from the Netherlands. And we were in an Irish community, and I sort of thought I was Irish for a long time because it was in a small town of Arthur. My dad moved there because they had a good big Catholic church, but it was an Irish community. And so we were at the school, and the Catholic school, and we had St. Patrick's Day was the biggest day of the year, bigger Christmas basically. And the kids had to sing all the songs. I'm off to Dublin in the green. And so we knew all these fabulous songs. And so some people still they say to me that they think I have an Irish accent, which is probably true. So the other thing that George often mentioned is Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe was first on the island, and he has every legitimacy, if you're not a Georgist, to make our man Friday work for him, for Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe didn't say, okay, there's 2 of us now, you can have half the island, or you deserve, or you have a right to half the island. No, Robinson Crusoe didn't say that. He said, you work for me, buddy. And if you're this is a common misconception throughout our whole society. And if you're a Georgist, you understand that for the first time. There are other examples when humans do the right thing quickly. You're having a hard time thinking of one right now, aren't you? In 1987, after a couple of international conferences, there was the Montreal Protocol, and they decided to abolish CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were eating the ozone layer, because it was completely understandable, and everyone knew that we were frying ourselves and frying the planet if we continued to destroy the ozone layer. So that was a very quick action, and here we are 50 years later, and the ozone layer has recovered almost completely by now. So that's a wonderful example of how humans actually do the right thing once in a while and don't act totally against their own best interest. Whereas climate change, that's another question. How long are we courting parabolic climate change right now by inaction? Sometimes I think if there was a hot weather event in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh that lasted a week, we could have 1 billion dead people in 1 week if it went above 50 degrees. Pardon? Yeah, they don't have the AC down there. So I mean, that's the stage we're at now, right? We're at the stage of cataclysmic climate change, and we are doing next to nothing so far. First Nations, Brendan, you mentioned at the beginning, they were communitarian. They fought tooth and nail with the neighboring nations, but within their nation, they more or less shared everything. They shared the wealth of the land with each other, and they had to because they needed everyone to help everyone survive. They knew that they had to take care of everyone in their group. And if someone killed someone, they would ostracize them for a week or two, or a month or two, or a year, and then they would welcome them back and blame it on the evil spirits, sort of, because they needed that person as a hunter for the next winter. So then when the European settlers started coming over in South America and Central America and the southern USA, they stuck with the feudal system there, the hacienda system, whereas like one person owned the thousands of acres and everyone else was their indentured servants, were slaves, basically. Whereas in Canada and the northern states, we came over and a lot of us were Germans and Dutch and Irish, and we owned our land back there. So then Canada and northern US was settled with everyone owned their own land. Even during the fur trade and the lumber baron era, all the people who worked in the fur trade and worked in the lumber barons owned their own farm and were semi-agrarian. So in Canada, we came up with this idea that we were able to rise with the market right from the get-go. So we were basically Georgists from the get-go. We each got our share of the unearned income. When my parents came to the Netherlands, came to Canada in 1950, In 6 years, they bought a farm. And so we started collecting the economic rent right away in my family. So just like everyone else, all the neighbors, no one rented land in those days. No one rented any other farmer's land. Everyone had their own 100 acres. That was the era still. And as soon as everyone owns their own land, you have pride and you feel you're part of the community. And it's really important for democracy and for economics, because it's a wonderful thing. And that's when you go travel in South and Central America, they have high walls around every house with shards of glass around them. It's just so sad that they don't have at least this economic equity that we have in North America. So anyway, speaking of the Dutch thing, Spinoza, 200 years before Henry George, Spinoza, he wanted the abolition of immovable property. So that includes your piano, Frank. Anyway, so Spinoza was a proto-Georgist 200 years before George. Spinoza thought land should be common property, which was a crucial step toward peace and accord in his view. So I'm sort of proud of my heritage, that I had a proto-Georgist in my roots. There are still a number of Georgist communities in Canada, and they are the Hutterites, the Amish, and the Mennonites. They sell off farm as much as they can, and they buy more land, and they set their kids up on land. And they understand. They must have read Progress in Poverty a long time ago. Well, the Mennonites were Tolstoy helped them travel around the world, immigrate around the world. So was Tolstoy not a Georgist, was he? Yeah, so maybe he taught them how to buy land. They're not making any more of it. I don't know how you say that in Russian, but. So somebody said to me a while ago, Frank, who are the best mafia or the worst mafia ever? And I said, well, of course, it's the Italian mafia or the worst. No, they're not the worst. Well, the American mafia, Chicago, no, they're not the worst. And I said, okay, well, who's the best mafia? He said, the British aristocracy, the landowning class in England, huge estates, and they had villages on. You watch Downton Abbey? Have you guys all watched Downton Abbey? No, you don't have to admit it. Lord Grantham, he owned the big estate there. He owned Downton Abbey, and they had the whole town, the doctor, everyone was living on his land, and they were on his payroll. It was a massive mafia situation. The question is, why do mafia exist? And of course, the peasants weren't able to revolt in Downton Abbey's case, but in Italy or in the US, where you have mafia, they charge for protection, right? And so if you are a mafia person and you go to the restaurants and the stores and you say, okay, you have to give me a certain amount of money every month, whatever, for protection, then if the store and the restaurants give you that money, it means that they have more money than they actually need to run their business, because they are collecting economic rent, because they own the land where the store is on. So they're collecting economic rent, and they share it with the mafia people who are extracting payments. So the mafia folks understand, Henry George, that you can collect rent. You can collect unearned income from people who have land. And then, of course, there's pirates. The pirates used to raid and take over ships and steal the gold and all that. But the people who owned the merchant ships, they could afford it. They could afford to let the pirates steal a bunch of their money every once in a while, because they were making so much. They were collecting all this unearned income. And so the pirate system is based on economic rent capture in another way. There's another great example of doing things right, and that's open source computers like Linux. Linux is a fabulously amazing thing, and it is really, really well, because it is they opened it up, the common world. It's like land, it's like the commons. Linux is the commons. Microsoft is going down because they're proprietary. They're not, which is really nice to hear.
5 more minutes, Frank, and then
Yeah.
we'll go to the final question.
Okay. I just want to talk about the central banks, because central banks they have only one tool in their toolkit, and that is raising or lowering interest rates. If the central bank raises interest rates, it's they're because they want to stop speculation or reduce house prices, then at the same time they are killing the productive economy. And if the central banks lower interest rates to help the productive economy, they are actually spurring the speculative economy. So the whole up and down, the only tool that the central banks have in their toolbox is a blunt instrument that doesn't do any good. It's like going to your car mechanic and all he has is a hammer, and you get worried then at that point. Oh yeah, when you go talk to a real estate person, you say to the real estate person, what's my house worth? And they go, oh, I don't know, it's worth, well, that one sold for that. Maybe it's worth 300,000. But if you tell the real estate person that the upfront cost of a house is actually roughly 10 years worth of anticipated economic rent, that's how you can arrive at the price of a house, by doing a calculation of the 10 years worth of anticipated future economic rent. Real estate people don't know this, and if you tell them that, they don't care what you tell them, but it's pretty funny. The other thing is about political people and taxation, what we're talking about. We want the political people to endorse and to implement LVT, but political people, they got onto this idea that they should tax everything a little bit, because that confuses the public and no one can really complain. So we tax everything a little bit, and that's how you raise your revenue. So it's really hard to ask a politician to use the tax structure as a policy tool, because they don't want to use the tax structure as a policy tool. The average home owning retiree is now worth about 1.7 million, 6 times more than the average retired renter. So if you're a renter, you're probably going to end up very poor when you finally retire, because all your money goes into rent. I feel like one of those guys in the subway that's on the phone but not talking to anyone, but they're just gesticulating. You ever feel like that? Okay, again, in order for politicians to accept anything, we all know about the Overton window, of course. So everything, you know, when Justin Trudeau and the Liberals decriminalized marijuana, that was, I think, a fantastic thing. Not that I don't even smoke the darn stuff, but it was the most wonderful thing. But it must have been really well, completely in the Overton window for him to do that, which was fantastic. So we took the opportunity. Whereas then when he put in the carbon tax, whether they bungled the rollout or what didn't label it properly, it was a disaster, and it obviously got rolled back by another liberal leader. So that was an example. There's another example of something happening in Ontario that I know about, because I'm interested in forestry issues. For all my life, I've been battling against spraying herbicides after forestry, right? Because they want to kill the deciduous trees so that the conifers will grow. But it's not good for the foresters, far more forest fires and all that, and species diversity drops and all that. But now in Ontario, throughout Northern Ontario, with First Nations and everyone, municipalities, they're all getting together and forcing the Ontario government to stop spraying herbicides after clear cuts. And this is because the spraying of pesticide or herbicides is within the Overton window now in Northern Ontario, and it's very exciting. There's also something called the Shelling Point, which you guys all know what the Shelling Point is? Yes. Shelling Point is what, the great example is, if you have to meet somebody in New York, but you can't talk to them, then you both assume that you have to meet at Central, what's it called? Grand Central Station. And if you don't have a time established, you know that you should be there at noon, because that's when they're probably there. So what our job is as Georgists, to try to get land value capture or rental value capture so much popularized to the point where it's within the Shelling Point, where it becomes natural for everyone. And if governments and politicians are run out of every other possible idea, they will be ready to adopt rental value capture as soon as the job situation is so grim that they won't be able to tax incomes anymore. So we have to be hopeful that progress or circumstances will coincide with our project so that it'll happen. I will end with a quote by Victor Hugo. There is no force so strong as an idea whose time has come.
Thank you, Frank. Is there any questions on line for Frank Dion at all? And is there any in the room of question for Frank Dion? Yeah. Okay, so we'll take a question in the room for Frank, and we'll check if there's any online.
Think back to those four elections. What is the hardest economic intuition or misapprehension that it's most hard to disabuse people of at the front door?
Well, as a Georgist?
As a Georgist, yeah.
Well, that one was basically what I was saying, like that I couldn't convince my own party. I couldn't convince my own party that income taxes were a bad idea. Why do we tax something that we want? You know, we had this slogan, very forward slogan, tax bad's not goods. That was our economic program. And then so I explained to them, well, jobs are good, aren't they? Well, yes, they are. Well, then why are we taxing them? But they couldn't get it. They couldn't make that leap because I guess they didn't feel comfortable to be able to sell it themselves. And then if you're going to forego income taxes, what do you tax more? Well, then people say, well, you should tax consumption. And a lot of Greens would say, well, we should tax consumption, but that's an equally bad tax or equally stupid tax because we should be taxing the use and the abuse of nature. But then as soon as you say that too, then people say, well, my grandma lives downtown Guelph and she has a garden and you're going to tax her out of her house. You know, the old grandma thing. So, I mean, as soon as someone says that in a room of 300 people, you're screwed. So yes, it was a non-starter, and it's still a non-starter. The Green Party doesn't get it at all. They're still. Pardon? Yes, I love Anna and Chad. That's what I'm going to be supporting. Yeah.
Is there a question, John?
No, I don't think so. There's discussions, but.
Okay. I'll ask you, maybe stand just for the camera there, Frank. So we'll continue off that thing. I've got one question. What in your political career, because we don't need to talk, I put in about the difficulty, we've got multi-levels of government, the difficulty of the George's political jobs of dealing with those. Is it ever possible to do it?
Well, I think everything we talk about, there are possibilities, there's inroads. And obviously the most straightforward one is shifting off of buildings and onto land. That resonates with a lot of people, and it's not as far-fetched as any other idea. So that's the one you could consider that low-hanging fruit. And then it's a lead into all the other Georgist ideas.
And is there anything that you've learned in politics that is like sticks in your mind? You mentioned a couple of things, but is there anything that you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I would reiterate the thing that's most important in politics is what I said at the beginning, that a politician has to build personal relationships with as many people as possible. And they can't be bullshit relationships. They have to be genuine. And that's not easy. But that's, you know, there are types of politicians, and there's the policy politician, there's the process politician, and then there's the people politician. And the people who almost always get elected are the people because they talk in aspirational, glamorous language, and they're warm and fuzzy, and they go like this to people, you know, and they kiss babies, and well, that they can't do anything more at this point. But anyway, so I mean, that's the thing. We have to really dip into our humanity. And George he gives us everything you need. You got all the arguments are there in George, because it's all based on humanity and human societies and families and work and play, and so that's the take.
Thank you. Well, why don't we, thanks a lot. We'll invite Frank Peddle back up. We're supposed to go to 4 o'clock. We've got 10 minutes left. And we'll take any more questions. Josie's online as well. Maybe I'll go back to Josie and Steve. We've got a few more minutes. Is there anything you want to add, Josie or Steve, from your perspective?
I actually just wanted to lift up that I think there's a couple questions chat for Frank. But Frank, I really enjoyed your remarks and miss having you on the PPI board, but it's great to see that you're continuing the good work.
Thank you, Josie.
Thank you, Josie.
Yeah, so I'll read, because I can see the question from Rick Demar. Would Frank be okay with an income tax which only targeted unearned income but regarded wages as one's non-taxable personal property?
I didn't understand the question. Say it again, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, or somebody there could read it. It says, would Frank be okay with an income tax which only targeted unearned income but regarded wages as one's non-taxable personal property?
Well, wages should not be taxed. So that's correct, because wages is earned income. And the Henry George thing is to capture unearned income and not earned income. And to make that distinguishing, Liam, to go back to your question, something that's super hard to explain to people is what's the difference between unearned income and earned income? Because people think capital gains is earned. And so there's a lot of confusion about that. So yes, that's what we always should talk about, making a distinction between earned and unearned income, between the productive economy and the speculative economy. Whereas most people and economists never make this delineation either.
There's also a question about how is public land in Canada offered for lease to private entities? Is the system by competitive bidding?
Yes, you mean private land is people bid it in the real estate world. I think it's just the same as the US, right? We have in Ontario, we have a blind bidder system for real estate. I think that's the way it is all over Canada and the US. Does anyone know? I suspect it is the same as the USA.
The question was, how do we deal with bids for the use of Crown land? If I want a forestry license.
Oh, okay. So you just said it. They're offered a license or yeah.
The question was, is that offered to the highest bidder? Is it a competitive bid that gets it?
For the most part, it is. Like the electromagnetic spectrum is an auction. And I would hope to think, as far as I know, it is a bidding system for forests or minerals and oil. I think it's the same as the USA as well there.
Other than
bid as rights that on public lands at the moment, but the process now for new or renewal of rights is mostly better.
And the EM spectrum situation, it's not an annual auction, it's a one-time auction until it should be an annual auction, because the smaller telecoms have to buy bandwidth off of the big guys. So it's this whole bizarre system as well.
There's a question here as well from Max Clark online, and it's about maybe Frank, you can speak to this one. It's sort of about George's opinion on the election processes and democracy. And this question specifically is about if you're familiar with sortition, which is the random selection of members of legislative bodies. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, or if you have any thinking on what George has said about democracy and elections.
Right. Well, George, I don't know a lot about that specific or what is meant by that random selection. Seems random to me today, to some extent, but George made a lot of contributions to having secret ballots, because in his day in the corruption of Tammany Hall, you had to stand up and say, I vote for Henry George, or I vote for Abram Hewitt, who ran against him in the mayoral election of 1886. He also did a lot for you thinking about voting systems, not first alternatives to the first past the door system and so on. There was tremendous, as there is today, and in many societies, there was absolutely horrendous corruption at the time in elections, and he was part of many of the reform movements to do that. So he's well known for that. Actually, some of these developments in just the mechanisms of democracy, right? For people who don't know, he came in second in the election in 1886 for mayor of New York. He was up against a guy named Abram Hewitt, who was the former Speaker of the House, U.S. Congress, and was a well-known player. And he was brought in because George said, well, I'm not going to run unless I have 30,000 names on a petition of people who want me to run to be mayor. They got that very easily. They got well over that amount, and he ran. And of course, some people think there is a theory out there, and Louis Post is probably part of this cohort that thought he did win the election to the mayor, but it was so corrupted. So rigged elections are no new phenomena. But he did beat Teddy Roosevelt, who obviously came on. So running for mayor of New York was often seen back then as a stepping stone in a way to being president of the United States. So or at least a governorship and so on. It's hard to imagine what the history would be of the United States subsequent to that if George had ended up as president, right? I think the history of the 20th century would have been quite different from what it came to be.
We've got time for one more question online. Any more? If not, maybe I'll pass it. We've got 2 minutes. Maybe I'll pass it over to Josie with some parting words from the Progress and Poverty Institute about the challenges ahead.
Well, we're ending with the challenges. Okay. Well, first of all,
anything, or you can be positive.
well, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to collaborate with you on this event and also future endeavors, because I know while our government anyway may not be particularly friendly in the moment, I think it's really we're all in this together and all sort of working towards the same end. And so I think, yes, absolutely there are challenges, and we can spend limitless time talking about those, but I'd rather focus on the opportunities, on moving forward, and on the fact that we do have this wisdom to rely on, and that even though it is more than 100 years old at this point, it is still incredibly salient today, in ways that, I kind of wish it weren't, but we're going to lean into that. So I just want to express gratitude, and more than challenges, hold up the opportunities that are in front of all of us right now.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you for your team for making this possible, this link with our in-person and our online viewers. Frank Peddle, any parting words?
I wish I had another 100 years.